Hello everyone, welcome to Delight. Week 2, we are so excited that you are here. If you haven't met me yet, hi, my name is Grace. I am one of your Delight leaders this semester. And this week we are talking about Acts chapter 2, and in our book it is titled The Power of the Spirit. So if you didn't get a chance to read it, no worries, I'm about to go through it right now. I got my notes right here, so let's go ahead and dive right in. So last week, Deja led us through chapter 1 of Acts. And if you remember anything from last week, right before Jesus ascended into heaven, he promised his disciples two things. So the first thing is that they would receive power. And the second thing is that they would be his witnesses here on earth. So Acts 2 is really special because this is where we see those promises start to hold true. So this week's story starts off in Jerusalem. And the people are celebrating Pentecost. And if you don't know what Pentecost is, no worries. I got a Spark Notes version for you right here. Basically, it was just a big Jewish festival and feast that honored the first fruits of the harvest. So this was a big deal. The streets were full and people came from all over to celebrate, all walks of life, all backgrounds. So we can imagine that this was a very busy day for all kinds of people. So maybe your hometown has some sort of festival or you go to a festival every year. So think of that like on steroids. Like this is the Coachella of the New Testament, and it's not about music. It's all about, celebrating this bountiful season of harvest that they've had and being grateful for what has been given to them during this season. So, however, the whole vibe of this day changes instantly in verse 2. It says, "Suddenly a sound like that of rushing wind came from heaven and filled the whole house they were staying." So they, being the disciples. And then verse 4 goes on and says, "They were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in different tongues as the Spirit enabled them." So, just putting this in a picture, the disciples began to speak all different languages. And it's not like they were studying these languages on the side. Like, they had no idea what these languages were. They had never spoken them before, probably even looked at them before, and yet they were speaking them fluently. So, I love the distinction that the NIV version makes. It says, "as the Spirit enabled them." And this is where Jesus' promise is fulfilled. It's nothing that the disciples did. It's because the Spirit allowed them to be filled with this, that they were able to speak in these languages. And so this is where his promise is filled. His people were filled with the Spirit. And because of this, the people that came from all over for this festival were finally hearing the story of Jesus in their native languages. So the disciples weren't just having small talk in these languages like, "Hey, what's up?" No, they were talking about Jesus. They were talking about the miracles that he performed while he's here on earth, and the amazing things he has done and who he is. The disciples were spreading the gospel. And they were Jesus' witnesses, just like he promised that they would be. So this definitely isn't an ordinary thing that we, or really anyone, would expect to see on the daily, especially now. And honestly, if we were out at the store and random people just started speaking a different language, I would be so concerned and confused. And this is what happened here too. People even claim that the disciples were just drunk. So, the Spirit is something that is so just miraculous and can bring up so many emotions. So obviously there's going to be a mix of emotions when the Spirit moves. However, when the Spirit moves, we are called to move also. Now, I'm sure most of us won't experience something like this, but we will see the Spirit move in other ways. And it's okay to feel overwhelmed or maybe even a little scared when the Spirit moves. But just remember that the Spirit is part of the Trinity of God, and God is good. So when the Spirit moves, it is good. And maybe, you're not going to hear the, people speaking in tongues, or maybe you're not going to hear the voice of God, but, there are other ways that the Spirit moves. You feel that pounding in your chest, things happen. It's different for everyone. But I want to encourage you that if you don't hear the voice of God or something like that, it's okay. I've been following Jesus my whole life, and I've never audibly heard the voice of God. That's okay. It's not some milestone that you hit where it's like, congratulations, you made it. No. The Spirit is for all of us, but it is different for all of us. We all have different relationships with God, and just because the Spirit is moving differently for someone else does not mean that their relationship, is better or more important to God than yours is. So I just want to encourage you guys with that as we're talking about this. And so the Spirit fell on everyone during that day at Pentecost, and it's not just the ones who went to church on Sunday, who read the Bible, the ones who follow the rules the best. The Spirit is for everyone. So now we turn to the second part of this story. And so during the midst of this chaos, Peter, who's a disciple, leaped up and began addressing the crowd. So he says in verses 22 through 24, "Fellow Israelites, listen to these words. This Jesus of Nazareth was a man attested to you by God with miracles, wonders, and signs that God did among you through him, just as yourselves know. Though he was delivered up according to God's determined plan and foreknowledge, you used lawless people to nail him to the cross and kill him. God raised him up, ending the pains of death, because it is not possible for him to be held by death." So this is a pretty big thing to say. These people are hearing about Jesus for the first time in their native languages, and Peter, steps up and declares this to these people. So yeah, Peter's one of the disciples, and the disciples are known as the people who followed Jesus. And they were his most devoted followers during his time on earth. However, when we look at our boy Peter, he is nowhere near perfect. So let's take a look at Peter's background. So Luke 5 talks about the story of Peter, who at this time was called Simon. The Bible has a thing for name changes. We're just going to roll with it. But for the sake of clarity, I'll just keep it Peter. But at this time, it was Simon. So basically, Simon, was in a boat fishing, and he was just having no luck at all. Bad fishing day. So once Peter was just about to call it quits, rolling the nets, Jesus told him to throw his net into the water again. So Peter scoffed, and he doubts that this would change anything. He had been fishing the whole day. What's this going to do? However, you can guess, as soon as Peter threw the nets into the water, he began catching so many fish. And it was so many fish that the boat actually began to sink. So Jesus then told Peter to follow him and become fisher of men. So this marks Peter starting his walk and his journey with Jesus. Peter was also the first person to declare Jesus as the Messiah and Son of God. So Jesus then changed his name, which was previously Simon, to Peter, which means rock. So Jesus told him that the church would be built upon the rock, also known as Peter's declaration that Jesus is the Son of God. Next, we see Peter just before Jesus was crucified on the cross. When Jesus was arrested and taken, Peter was questioned, and he denied knowing Jesus not one, not two, but 3 times out of fear of being, persecuted himself or crucified or punished. So he denied Jesus 3 times. So after this happens, in John, we see Peter fishing again. He liked to fish, I guess, but like always, he isn't catching anything. So then a man on the beach told him to try from the other side of the boat. And when he did, he began catching so many fish. And it's in this moment that Peter knew that the man on the beach was Jesus, raised from the dead. So we can imagine, Peter running towards Jesus, feeling so much joy of seeing his friend again, but also a little shame and guilt. Just days earlier, he had denied Jesus, and then Jesus died. That's kind of a bad way to end things. So later, after this, we see Jesus is having dinner with Peter and the disciples, and he asks him, "Do you love me?" And of course, Peter's like, "Yes, Lord, I love you, of course." But Jesus asks this not 1, not 2, but 3 times. So this is no coincidence that this happened 3 times. This confirmation that Peter loved Jesus covered what had happened just days before. And it's so easy to look at Peter and be like, oh my goodness, what the heck was he thinking? Denying Jesus? That is the worst of the worst. But let me tell you something, we are Peter. I am Peter. You are Peter. We are full of sin and shame. But there is hope, because Jesus still used Peter to help his kingdom. When Peter was addressing the crowd in verse 14, it says, he raised his voice. He was bold and filled with the Spirit, despite the past mistakes he had done. It's so easy to get caught up into the lies of the enemy and believe that when we mess up or we fall into sin, there's no way we can ever earn our way back into the kingdom of heaven. But we can take heart in knowing that we can never earn our way into it in the first place. And that's why we have Jesus. Falling into this trap of legalism, which is thinking that you can earn your way into the kingdom of God or make him love you more by your actions or anything like that, is such an easy thing to get caught up in. And this world tells us that we need to be perfect and have it all together. But Jesus knows we don't. We don't have it all together. And that's why he died on the cross for us. So now our Delight book prompts us to get pretty serious this week. I mean, it's only week 2. Hold on a second here. But it asks, is there something in your life or a decision from your past that you feel has canceled your usefulness in the kingdom? And then it says, lay it before Jesus right now. Wow, okay. Honestly, I read this question and I felt a little bit of a knot in my throat. My stomach just dropped. We all have that one thing we wouldn't dare to share. The thing that's so dark, you bury it way down deep. And for me, that is sexual sin from my past. I was young, early teen years, and honestly, it wasn't a good situation, but I still made that choice. And it happened 6 years ago, and I buried it deep down. I didn't tell a single soul until right before I came to college about a year ago. And let me tell you something, she still had to pry it out of me. Like, it didn't come easily. I didn't feel like I knew I needed to share, but I didn't want to, obviously. But I held it in that long. And looking back on it, it's kind of ridiculous I held it in that long. My entire high school career and beyond, I was carrying that guilt and shame. I convinced myself that Jesus didn't want me anymore. I was dirty. I was gross. I wasn't pure as pure as I once was. I'd messed up, and in a big way. I was a small group leader at my church for little girls. I led worship on stage. I would sing on stage on Sundays, and I felt so unfit. I lived with so much shame and guilt for so long that I convinced myself that if I didn't think about it, I could move on. Or I can convince myself that if I didn't think about it, maybe it didn't happen. So since first telling my friend this, I've been able to open up to the people closest to me. And now, obviously, all of you watching this, which is a little scary, might I add, but each time I share, it gets a little easier. And I feel the weight that I had placed on myself for so long being lifted. I think back to that night when I first told her, and I can remember the freedom that I felt. She had been one of my closest friends since elementary school. Like, she knew me at my core. Like, we grew up together, and yet I was shaking, trying to work up the courage to just spit it out, just say it out loud. And when I finally said it, I remember the look on her face. She wasn't shocked. She wasn't mad. She wasn't disgusted. She looked at me with just pure love. Like, she saw me at my core and she still chose to love me. And I think of her face, and I think that's how Jesus was looking at me in that moment too. And that whole time I was just carrying that guilt and shame. My lowest, most vulnerable moment, and they both looked at me as if I was something so precious that they wanted to love and be gentle with. The freedom I felt in that moment is unlike anything I've ever felt before. And you can imagine that a lot had built up in those 6 years. So maybe you're sitting there and you're like, okay, but Grace, you don't know what I've done. You don't know that I've struggled with sexual sin my whole life, every day. or that I struggle with drug and alcohol abuse or addiction to porn, or that I come from a broken family. The list goes on and on and on. And I'll tell you something, you're right. I don't know. I don't know your story. I don't know what you go through on the daily. However, I do know my God, and He is merciful and kind, and He gives grace. And your sin was covered before it even happened. Before you were even born. You know, Jesus still would have died on that cross even if it was just for you and your one sin. He died for everyone. And I also know that your place of security that you get from pushing it so down deep is nowhere. It's nothing compared to the amount of freedom and peace you will feel when you let it go. I know it can feel almost comforting to have control of that, and if I don't say anything, then no one will know. However, the freedom that you can step into is so much greater than the feeling you get from having control. I held on to my sin for so long, and it held me back from the gift of peace that God had for me and the plans He had for me. I held on to that. I looked at myself as if I was dirty and disgusting for so long. And now that I'm free from this, I look at the world differently. I look at others differently. I look at myself so much differently. And I look at God differently. I'm able to protect the relationship I have now, and I'm able to set boundaries that I value more than ever now. In order to let God use your mess, you have to let Him free you from it. Really think about that. In order for God to use your mess, you have to let Him free you from it, and you have to let yourself free you from it. So now we're going to go into a time of guided prayer in small group. If you feel that pounding in your chest and your heart is racing, and maybe you're a little red like I am, that's the Spirit telling you, do it, let go. Tell someone, tell anyone, release yourself. Let Jesus break these chains that you have let yourself hold on to. Just let it go. Don't say, yeah, Jesus, I trust you. I'm just gonna, keep it over here. No, drop it. Let go of it. And as women, we place this pressure on ourselves to look and act a certain way. Yes, this is true as women, but as Christian women, that is a whole nother level. You need to be kind, giving, a helper. You need to be pure. You need to be all these things. And yes, those things are great. However, Jesus knows that we aren't those things all the time. None of us are. None of us are those things at every given moment. We're human. But Jesus saved us from that. He saves us from that every day. So can we just leave the idea that we need to be perfect and proper and have it all together at the door, and maybe don't even pick it up. Don't even pick it up once you leave this apartment, because there's no place for that. We know that we're imperfect. Everyone in the room that you're in knows that they are imperfect. So let's just stop trying to act like we have it all together, or that we're not, maybe you're suffering internally. Let it go. So whether you know everyone in your small group, or maybe this is your first time in Delight, or maybe you don't quite know everyone in your small group yet, we all have one thing in common. We are flawed, imperfect people, but we are all saved by Jesus. You can't fool God. God knows that we are not perfect. So we all have that in common. At Delight, we're all about vulnerability. And so when someone is vulnerable, no matter how dark, how ugly it is, we're not surprised. We look at you, we're not disgusted. We don't tell you, get out. Nothing like that. We look at you with love. The way my friend looked at me, the way Jesus looks at me and you, that's what you'll receive. And so nothing is too dark ugly, big or small, to be shared. So I really just want to encourage you guys, let's just be real and be bold. You know, this world is hard. We struggle with things. And quite honestly, these things are not talked about enough. They're not talked about enough in the church, you know, with other Christian women. Let's just break those walls. Let's talk about it. Because if you don't talk about it, it's hard to fix it. So let's make those steps. Let's be bold. Let's be courageous. The Spirit has you covered. Jesus has you covered. Once you share, you know, He's got you. You're protected. You're held in His arms. So let's just be real and bold, and have courage, and let the Spirit fill us, just like Peter speaking out onto the crowd. So I hope you guys have a great small group time, and I hope to see you all soon. Bye.